6.
Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week in Aravo. I'm Kyle Brasser with Compliance Week and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is third-party risk management, our programs up to scratch. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of their presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please be sure you are using either Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser, and you have disabled your pop-up blockers in order to ensure access to the exam. Once I have signed off and the webcast is completely over, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcast@complianceweek.com. Once again, to ensure receipt of your CPE credit, please be sure you're using Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser. If you've missed anything, I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you'll also find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, you can also hit the View Slide full screen button at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce Fry Warnick, partner in the Government Investigations and White Collar Practice Group of Vincent & Elkins. Fry conducts internal investigations and defends companies and individuals against government investigations into alleged violations of the FCPA, AML statutes, the Bank Secrecy Act, and other financial and corruption-related offenses. We also have Kimberly Allen, Chief Marketing Officer at Aravo. Kimberly brings more than a decade of executive leadership experience in the governance, risk, and compliance space, building brand recognition, thought leadership, and revenue-accelerating marketing programs at companies including Thomson Reuters, SAI Global, the Global Association of Risk Professionals, Practical Law Company, and ComplyNet. It's great to have you all with us today, and with that, I will turn it over to Kimberly to get us started.
Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it. And it's great to see so many of you joining us today, so thanks for joining. I'm also really excited to be joined by Fry today, as he really brings such great experience and perspective, having worked both as a federal prosecutor at the DOJ and now defending companies and individuals against government investigations. So his inputs today will be extremely valuable. Thank you, Fry.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great. So the approach that we're going to take today is to take some of the results of a recent survey that Aravo conducted with Compliance Week. And we're going to talk about the results in the context of the recently updated DOJ evaluation of corporate compliance programs. Now, as we looked at the results, there are a few that really stood out when we also studied the updates to the guidance. So just to set the scene here, the benchmarking survey is the third annual survey that we've conducted on third-party risk management. This year, we conducted it with Compliance Week. There were 277 respondents from a wide range of industries, and it was a global survey, but predominantly from respondents who were headquartered in the US, 66%. It's a very broad survey that incorporates both quantitative and qualitative question sets. So today we'll be focusing just on a few highlights, and the full report will be published and available in a few weeks' time. Then the DOJ's evaluation of corporate compliance programs, I anticipate and would hope that most of you on today's call will be familiar with. This, of course, is the guidance on how the DOJ evaluates compliance programs when making its corporate charging decisions. And it was recently updated to reflect a few updates in June 2020. So we're going to kick off with the expectations of programs being adequately resourced and empowered. This is interesting as there was a very specific update in the guidance which incorporated this language, and you can see it redlined in this slide. So Fry, as someone who's worked within the DOJ and has been a prosecutor, Why do you think the DOJ has made this particular revision?
Thanks again, Kimberly. I think this is the revision that has gotten the most publicity since the June revisions. As you mentioned, the document itself, the Evaluating Corporate Compliance Programs, was a document that was produced initially in April 30th of just last year, 2019. And that document harmonized a number of different policy documents that had been promulgated over the decade previously into a more concise document that was supposed to inform prosecutors, but also in-house counsel, compliance professionals as well, on what exactly DOJ's expectations are for compliance programs. These edits that came out just 2 months ago helped tweak them, and then this particular one on adequately resourcing, empowering, is significant. And I think there's two reasons why I say that. I mean, number one is the previous language was much more subjective by nature. It was being implemented effectively being the question. It doesn't necessarily have hard metrics you can evaluate. This is now telling compliance personnel and companies, we want to see adequate resourcing and empowerment. And what does that mean? Well, it means we want to actually see the numbers. What are the percentage personnel in your compliance function versus the overall numbers of the company? What are the dollars that are spent on compliance compared to other areas at the company? It is something that is a little more discreet, something more you can really sink your teeth into. And so, in some ways should be a more meaningful edit for companies to realize, okay, how do we present our program to the agencies when we have to defend our compliance program? So it's signaling that's going to matter to DOJ. Money talks. I think that's, if you really wanted to nail it down, that they're going to matter. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this happens in the midst of the pandemic. The reality is everyone knows, including at DOJ, that companies are being forced to make cuts. People are being furloughed, being laid off. There's a lot of things that has happened in a very short period of time. The fact that these edits took place, just a couple of months ago, right in the middle of it all, was a shot across the bow to compliance professionals and to companies to say, and frankly, a way to empower compliance personnel inside their companies to say, look, DOJ is watching. I know we're making cuts. We better make sure that these cuts are not overly represented in our function, and perhaps we need to be more focused on making sure that even in this time of uncertainty, we're able to continue to act responsibly. So I think these are really, if I was to drill down on this particular edit, this is what DOJ was aiming at. One side note here, as you said earlier, I was assistant chief of the FCPA unit. I worked in the FCPA unit for 5 years as a federal prosecutor for 11. The resourcing issue matters also because while the rest of the world might be getting under-resourced, DOJ is not. In the 5 years I was in the FCPA unit, the number of prosecutors doubled in size and went from 19 prosecutors to 35 prosecutors. And the international outreach to try to bring bigger cases really was a focus of the department. And I think you've seen the results of that happening year after year after year with record-breaking numbers in terms of corporate prosecutions, individual prosecutions. So one thing to really keep in mind is while companies are downsizing, the government is actually expanding and really continues to be motivated to bring these cases.
Thanks, Brian. I think there's really important points to draw on there, and that the DOJ is making these revisions with intent. So let's take a dive into some of the results of the survey. We did ask the survey respondents directly if they considered that their programs had the right level of funding to run their programs successfully for the people, the skill sets, and the coverage to run their programs. The tools, this is the technology and the content sets that you need to draw on as part of your compliance programs, whether they have the right tools, funding for tools to run the program successfully, and also for innovation and continuous improvement. Is there enough funding to continually mature your program? And across the board, a third signaled strongly that they thought it was inadequate in each of these areas. And the interesting thing here is this is absolutely consistent with the last 2 years' results as well. A third of respondents in the last two surveys, and now the third year, are feeling that they're not being adequately funded to run their program successfully. Then we looked at team size. Fry mentioned that one of the things that the DOJ will be looking at is what kind of personnel do you have, what kind of personnel coverage. We found that 27% of those who responded had no dedicated team to manage third-party risk. 42% had between 1 and 5 people to manage third-party risk, which really means that 69% of programs have 5 or less dedicated to managing third-party risk. So you might ask yourself, well, maybe these programs aren't managing many third parties. So there was another question in the survey just in terms of how many third parties do you manage? Take a look at that. So you'll see that they're managing a lot. Now, 36% of organizations with no dedicated team were still managing more than 5,000 third parties in their programs. 23% of organizations with no dedicated team were still managing between 500 and 5,000 third parties. The picture was a little bit better in teams of 1 to 5. Here, 26% were managing more than 5,000 third parties, and 22% were managing between 500 and 5,000 third parties. So really what this tells us is despite having small teams dedicated to third-party risk, there's still a high number of third parties that they're being expected to manage. We also looked at budget. And here we asked respondents what was their budget in US dollars outside headcount. And here you can see that 10% of respondents said they had no budget for third-party risk. 35% had less than 5,000 US dollars, and 23% had between $5,000 and $50,000. Again, when you start to consider the scope of third-party risk management programs, the number of third parties that are being managed, the risk exposure that they can expose the business to, these are proportionally high budgets. Turning now to some of the more qualitative responses that we had in the survey, here we invited respondents to voice the greatest challenges ahead for their programs over the upcoming 12 months in their own words. We saw sort of typical responses that highlighted the lack of resources here. So having enough people to properly manage third-party risk came up. Budgetary challenges, obtaining necessary resources to bring programs to industry best practice were typical types of responses that we had in the survey. And then also, interestingly, often these responses were connected and tied to a lack of senior management support. So convincing management of the need for more resource, budget and support from the C-suite. Here we see sort of across both the quantitative results in the survey that were connected to resource and funding, as well as the qualitative, these real sort of struggles for resource and empowerment are coming through. And sort of at this point, we thought it might be interesting to run an audience poll. So perhaps, Kyle, if we can just switch to the audience poll, which will appear on your screen. When you think about your own third-party risk management program resourcing, in your view, is it A, adequately resourced and empowered, B, mostly adequately resourced and empowered, with some improvement there, room there for improvement, or C, really not adequately resourced and empowered at all? There's a lot of room for improvement. And we'll just give you a few moments to respond to that survey. We'll share the results because they're anonymous. And then Brian and I will have a chat about resource and empowerment. Okay, I'm seeing the results coming through. And maybe Kyle, if you can share the poll with the responses with the audience now. We're seeing around half of respondents who feel that they're mostly adequately resourced and empowered, that there's some room for improvement there. Again, we're seeing a third, very typical of the responses that we saw in the last 3 years of surveys that we've done of respondees who are not feeling adequately resourced and empowered at all, that there's a lot of room for improvement there. And then we're sitting at around the 12% mark for those who do feel that they're getting the adequate resource and empowerment to run their programs successfully. So as we look at these results, do they suggest that programs are adequately resourced and empowered?
Well, I mean, I think the numbers are striking. Some of the data that you presented from the survey previously, and consistent with what we're seeing here today, you certainly see a concern internally in companies that they aren't fully on top of the third-party management issues. And why I say it's striking is third-party risk is still, by and large, the predominant risk factor, certainly in corruption cases, but also in financial fraud and otherwise. And I can say from the experience I had investigating these cases for the Department of Justice, now on the other side internally, 99 times out of 100, when you come across a problem, it's because you have a third-party issue. And the need to beef up the resources is substantial, and unfortunately, we're having this discussion, like I said earlier, at a time when a number of companies are being forced to tighten their belts. So, but to answer your question, on a big picture level, certainly the data suggests that they're not being adequately resourced the way that the department would want. Now, I'll say, you need to get in the weeds here and go company by company, because most importantly, what you'll need to do, first of all, third parties run the gamut. They can be just typical vendors. They could be joint venture relationships which pose certain risks, and certainly third parties that are engaged with contacts with government officials pose substantial risks. And then that also depends on where we're talking about, which parts of the world we're dealing with. What the department is most focused on is going to be, and then the SEC and other government regulators are making sure that the approach you're taking is risk-based. So, if you have 5,000 vendors, but 4,900 of those really present lower risk profiles, then you need to be sure that the resources you are dedicating are focused on the remaining 100. And being, documenting that and making sure that, it's risk-based and data-driven, that's going to be the key to this. And so that could be hopefully what's happening at some of the companies that we're seeing, where people feel like they are adequately resourced, or maybe there are some minor areas for improvement.
So what role do you think senior management has in supporting adequate resource and empowerment across the business?
Well, look, senior management needs to understand the risk profile of the third parties. They need to be getting that feedback from the people on the ground who are managing those third parties, and then voicing that internally up the ladder. I mean, this is an area of increasing exposure for companies, and so senior management, it is going to be on them to make sure that the resources are available so that the compliance professionals can do their job.
Great. So let's move on now to another update that we saw in June to the guidance, which is specific to third-party risk management. And this is third-party lifecycle relationship management. The new verbiage in the document states does the company engage in risk management of third parties throughout the lifespan of the relationship, or primarily during the onboarding process? Fry, why do you think this specific update has been introduced?
Well, I think this is a big theme as well in the updated guidance, and also just a theme that we've all seen over the last few years who are practicing in this space. But continuous monitoring is increasingly of more and more importance, and it's something that DOJ is recognizing here with these edits. It's not going to be just something where when you have a third-party relationship that they just go through a due diligence in the onboarding stage, but there needs to be continuous verification. At least the department is going to expect that there is continuous monitoring and verification of what they're doing. There could be periodic refreshes of their diligence processes, and ensuring that the companies remain confident in what their third parties are doing. So that is in my understanding as to why these edits are there and why this is another common theme in these updates.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of this expectation that it's not a one and done process at the onboarding stage. Something to continually to look at throughout the life cycle. So we actually asked this question in the survey, whether programs address the full life cycle of the third party relationship. Only 30%. Sorry.
Well, no, I was only going to say, it's difficult. It becomes more difficult with a company that over the years develops and maintains a number of relationships that grow and grow and grow over the years. And you ultimately, it's not unusual for a large company to have thousands of these types of relationships. And so how do you do the continuous monitoring when it would be unfeasible to do continuous monitoring over all of those relationships? And so what I've seen with some effect is seeing companies, periodically, on a either random or periodic assessment phase, going back and choosing 5, 10, 50, 100 of those relationships, depending on the size of the company and the issue, and checking back on those relationships. I mean, that is something I think the department is going to certainly expect.
Yeah. And I think as we look at the results of the survey as well, only 30% that they're really doing this fully across their third parties. 34% said they were doing it partially, and then 23% said that they just weren't doing this. They weren't doing this at all. We did take a look at, in the survey, sort of both the initial due diligence and the ongoing due diligence of third parties. So I'll touch on that now. When we asked what proportion of third parties had initial due diligence conducted, a total of 44% of respondents had conducted initial due diligence on no more than half of their third parties. 4% said they hadn't really done this on any of their third parties, and you can see 16% said, we've done initial due diligence on between 1 and 10% of our third party universe. We compared this to the level of due diligence for ongoing, as part of the ongoing relationship. So when we asked what proportion of third parties had ongoing due diligence conducted, a total of 59% of respondents had conducted ongoing due diligence on 50% or less of their third parties, so no more than half, with 8% having done no due diligence, ongoing due diligence on their third parties. So we thought now, again, it's time for an audience poll just to establish, amongst the audience, sort of your own status of third-party lifecycle management in your program. Kyle, if you can just share the poll with the audience. So when you think about your own third-party risk management program, in your view, is it A, effectively managing risk through the full life cycle of the relationship with third parties? Is it B, mostly focused on onboarding, but making headway into extending into ongoing management? Is it C, just focused on onboarding, with little to no ongoing management, or D, not managing risk at any stage. Starting to see the responses coming through. At the moment, about 30% feel that they're doing this effectively through the full life cycle relationship with third parties. Looking at around 45% that are mostly focused on onboarding, but making headway into extending into ongoing management. Around 20% just focused on onboarding with little to no ongoing management. And there's around 5% on the call who are not managing risk at any stage. So Kyle, if you could send those results to the audience, that would be great. So again, Fry, as we look at these results and in the context of the expectation of the regulators, do the results suggest that programs are meeting this regulatory expectation?
Well, again, these results suggest otherwise, and it's not entirely surprising. Like we said, this is an area, I think, of increased focus, but it's also because there's an area that was deemed to be lacking, by the department and certainly within a number of companies and their compliance programs as well. So, there seems to be quite a bit of room for improvement in this space.
Great. Okay. And when you look at the ongoing management of your third parties, should you be doing this across all of your third parties or just your high risk and critical third parties? This is a question that comes up quite a lot.
Right, and look, you need to prioritize based on risk. We have to face the reality that companies are not going to have unlimited resources, and so, and all third parties are not built the same way. But those that do present risks, you need to dedicate the resources on. And why is it important, not just at the onboarding stage, but afterwards? Is there's an understanding that you learn through the process. You learn a number of things that may not have been covered in the initial due diligence phase, and so continued diligence afterwards, ensuring that the company is doing the tasks that you expect them to do in a thoughtful, legal way. It's not just about corruption risk, but it's also about efficiencies as well. And so, oftentimes those two can go hand in hand. And from just a dollars and cents standpoint, if you're going to have companies and people engaged to help you, you want to make sure that they're doing the best possible job they can do as well. So there's good financial reason to be doing this management, in addition to decreasing the risk of exposure from people like I used to be at DOJ or the SEC.
Great. I'm going to step now and touch on oversight of programs. So, the guidance continues to recognise that the tone starts at the top, but it does expand to include middle management as an agent for culture as well. Why do you think that they've made this particular change in the guidance?
It really is, to me, showing a maturity. It is the evaluation of compliance programs is still somewhat of a new phenomenon for prosecutors, and but it's now been going on for certainly for the last decade, where prosecutors are becoming better versed at this. When DOJ rolled out the evaluation of corporate compliance program policy guidance last year, it was actually done in conjunction with a full day of training for all for prosecutors, both in the criminal fraud section, in the money laundering section, various assistant U.S. attorneys around the country who are involved in corporate cases. And it's because there was an understanding that prosecutors need to have better training on evaluating corporate compliance programs. this goes hand in hand with just, as I was saying earlier, kind of a maturation internally as well within companies. Certainly, and especially I think U.S. companies that have had to deal with the FCPA and foreign bribery laws longer than others around the world. It's not just tone at the top anymore. I mean, that's a verbiage that we've all grown accustomed to, but understanding it can't just be the messaging from the CEO or the board. It really needs to be then implemented properly. And so ensuring this tone in the middle, really is a more sophisticated way that companies should be training the trainers. Companies should be implementing their rules and their policies and procedures that way. And the department now appreciating that that's an expectation as well.
Great. And again, the survey took a dive into particularly sort of this training to the top, and whether the board and senior management were engaged in programs. And we asked respondents whether they thought their board had a good handle on third-party risks that their organisation is exposed to. And again, what we found there was around 40% didn't feel that their board was well connected to the types of risks that their organisation was exposed to. We also looked at how you'd categorize board engagement with the third-party program, and this is important. It's come through in previous studies that we've done before and in this one, and it's probably no surprise that more mature programs tend to have a level of higher board engagement. And what we found in this survey is, again, around a third of respondents felt that there was a low level of oversight from their board, and that third-party risk management is just not a key priority for the board. About half felt that their boards had a moderate level of oversight, and 15% reported that they had a high level of oversight. So thinking about sort of board engagements and board senior management and middle management, is this a wake-up call for those individuals within organizations to pay more attention to third-party risk?
Well, I think if they weren't paying attention to this beforehand, then they certainly need to be. It's not a new risk area. And, one of the questions you have here is trending in individual prosecutions, and this isn't to necessarily scare people, but the reality is, I mentioned earlier, the Department of Justice, the SEC, have been working more and more of these cases. In the old days, it was a corporate case, and then you would rarely see individual prosecutions. You'd rarely see trials against individuals. That's no longer the case. Like I said, I was there at a period of rapid expansion and growth in both the maturation within the Department of Justice FCPA unit and how it brought these cases. The corporate cases blew up. And if you look in the history of the FCPA, which is the world's first foreign bribery law, passed in 1977, and in 43 years, there have been about $17 billion in global fines with the DOJ, the SEC, and foreign counterparts in a case that involved the U.S. $14 billion of those cases have happened in the last 5 years, excuse me. If you charted this on a graph, it would be a hockey stick, and you would really see just an extraordinary amount of cases now being brought, and that's happened as a result of the international cooperation that has expanded greatly. But also there was when the unit expanded, there was a concerted effort to bring in prosecutors to the unit that had prior prosecution experience, and I was one of those, and to build better cases. And the way those cases then are brought are by also building cases against the individuals. And so last year there were 40 individuals prosecuted, 35 by DOJ, another 5 by the SEC. And it wasn't just and that was a record. It broke the previous year's record that had broken the previous year's record. And it wasn't just the quantity, though, it was the quality. You're mentioning boards of directors, senior managers. There are now CEOs who've been charged. There have been partners at major financial institutions, bankers. There has been a member of a board of directors now charged. And so they're being charged in cases, almost all of them involving third parties. And the CEO of a major Dutch oil and gas company who got a 3-year sentence after pleading guilty was actually convicted on willful blindness. That was his mental state standard. He said he was aware of certain risks, but they went forward and did the conduct anyway and made the payments, knowing that there was a substantial likelihood that those payments would be used to pay bribes. And so ignorance is not a defense. And in fact, willful blindness is all that the government needs to show to prove its case. So if the government can show that there were red flags, that people knew about them, and yet they proceeded anyway with a high probability of illegality occurring, the government will make its case.
Great, some strong words and things to consider there, just in terms of the implications for individuals and senior management within companies. So finally, just in terms of looking at some of the results here, let's have a quick look at incidents. Now, some respondents to the survey didn't know if they had an incident, but of those that did know, 59% had experienced at least one incident associated with a third party in the last 12 months. This is down a little bit from our last year's results, which showed that 75% of respondents had experienced an incident with a third party, but still a high proportion of organizations experiencing third-party incidents. And this is where it gets quite interesting. So the survey also captured information from respondents about the magnitude of the impact of these events in the course of the survey, as well as their program maturity. And we used a 5-stage maturity model. Starts out sort of at the immature stage, just starting out at the ad hoc stage, moving through to fragmented. The defined stage sort of sits squarely in the middle, and then more mature programs are sort of at the integrated and the agile stage. And when we started to correlate some of the results in terms of the magnitude of the impact of events and the maturity of programs, there are just some interesting observations that came through. So if we looked at across all incidents that caused significant business or reputational damage, 71% of these were recorded from respondents and organizations with low levels of program maturity. This compared to 18% from respondents who had programs that were more mature. Then if we looked at incidents that caused some business or reputational damage, again, 63% of these were recorded from respondents and organizations with low level of maturity, compared to 15% from respondents who had programs who are more mature. And these are interesting. It does suggest that the more mature programs may help safeguard the organization against events causing damage. And this could be in part through better identification and better mitigation procedures that they have as part of a mature program. But again, I think this is an area that is interesting, and it calls for sort of further research and examination as well. We also asked those who had incidents, what was its nature? So we saw 45% of those who had incidents say it was a performance or quality issue. 22% had indicated that they had experienced data breaches. 21% indicated that it was a regulatory non-compliance issue. That could be, for instance, ABAC or GDPR in nature. And then 18% indicated that they'd had some kind of cybersecurity incident, such as hacking. Again, when we consider both the frequency of these incidents, the magnitude of them, and now the cost of these incidents, there's some sort of interesting things to call out. So data breaches, for instance, bring an average cost to an organization of $3.93 million, according to research by IBM and the Ponemon Institute. And you may have also seen and been alarmed by Capital One's $80 million civil penalty for its role in last year's breach that exposed the personal data of more than 100 million customers. And then, Fry's touched on this as well and can provide a little bit more insight here. But if we look at FCPA enforcement actions, the average action was 208 million last year. Again, this doesn't capture the true magnitude, and maybe, Fry can just provide a little bit more insight in terms of the costs of FCPA enforcement.
Sure. I mean, I do think that actually, if you're talking about cases, FCPA enforcement actions, I think this actually undersells the costs. The litigation fees associated with this, the investigation fees of looking into every incident. Of course, these enforcement actions in 2019 only those are the ones that were resolved with the department or the SEC, all the way through fruition. But usually that happens after 2, 3, 4, 5 years of negotiations with the government, of internal investigations that can be extraordinarily costly. And then there are the hundreds of cases that don't ultimately result in enforcement actions, but still have high costs associated with them. The tens of thousands probably of internal investigations happening at the same time. And I would only say the reputational damage here is hard to quantify, but I was just recently seeing yesterday an article about major companies refusing to do business with other well-known institutions who are tied up in investigations until they're resolved. And so, this certainly affects the bottom line in ways well beyond just what you see in the headlines.
Thanks. So, I mean, third parties have to be an area of concern for organizations. We're seeing them sort of at the root of many of the data breaches that are in the news headlines, and the FCPA enforcement actions and so forth. So, Fry, what are the biggest weaknesses that you've seen in programs, perhaps both as a prosecutor and also as you, defend companies as well, that can lead to these types of incidents?
Well, I think there are two big areas. When it comes to joint venture relationships, local partners, those types of third parties, the big areas are really understanding who's behind the company and who are they. When you're dealing with an ABAC type of issue, understanding, really knowing who you're dealing with, and that type of understanding is a big risk factor. Alternatively, is simply knowing where the money is going is a big issue, and that's happened with any type of third parties that are involved in whether that's with the client, whether that's government client or a private client. And so having better visibility and transparency into those processes, ensuring that the work that is being invoiced is actually being performed. Those are the big weakness areas that came across my desk when I was supervising and leading these cases, and that I have to deal with now when I'm helping companies on the compliance side or defending them and conducting internal investigations. Your next question there of is the cost of compliance greater than the cost of non-compliance? I'd certainly say that increasingly it is. As we see more and more enforcement, the stick that the government can wield in these cases has become larger and larger. And we're talking about dollars mostly, but we did touch on the individual prosecution side of things here, and there is a real awareness within the Department of Justice that the best deterrent for the government is going to be whether they can prosecute individuals, and that sends the type of message that the government is always trying to send to ensure compliance.
Great, thank you. I think that's a billion-dollar question, isn't it? Is the cost of compliance greater than the cost of non-compliance? So,
Right.
so just to wrap up, I think, as we look at the results of the survey and as we take sort of on board sort of the expertise of those who have been in the space for a period of time, there's data here that can really help build a value case for better third-party risk management. Many of you will be championing this within your organization. We can see from the results of the survey, there's frustrations that have been expressed in terms of, being able to secure the right resources and the right budget, being able to secure the attention of senior management. And I think there's some real opportunities here to leverage the guidance in terms of building this value case. The first is, as you champion this in your organization, there's really clear regulatory expectation now for adequate resource and empowerment. This means it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. So again, this is something I think to ensure that is bolstered in any conversations that you have with senior management. And then when it comes to senior management, there's also a very clear regulatory expectation for oversight. This is something that your senior management and your board should be sponsoring. And you've heard from Fry sort of some of the trends that are emerging in terms of individual accountability and prosecutions and liabilities here. So that's another thing to be considering. There's a need also to manage risk through the entire life cycle of the relationship. So this really means bringing stakeholders across the organization together, and this also provides the opportunity to bring resources and budgets together as well. Typically, you'd expect individuals from procurement, compliance, legal, and third-party risk, and business owners to be all part of a broader third-party risk management team. And the other thing is you bring these individuals across the organizations, there's different skill sets that you can, and expertise that you can leverage and harness as well. For instance, those in compliance may not have had a lot of experience in terms of negotiating and understanding the procurement process for the right technologies and tools. And this is something that your counterparts in procurement can really support you with. So there's an opportunity here as you look at this life cycle management and bringing various individuals across the organizations to start to pool expertise and resources and budgets across the business. I think there's also what came through is sort of a sense of better resilience, and operational resilience is something that the regulators, again, have been applying particular focus to, not just here in the US, but also abroad as well. And a mature program can help safeguard against incidents and the impact of those incidents. And we saw the cost of those types of incidents, such as data breaches, such as regulatory non-compliance. So better resilience is a return on investment. So I think these are all, sound points in terms of building a case, a value case for better third-party risk management. And Fry, from your experience, is there sort of other things that you'd share from your perspective from both sides of the fence here?
Oh, I'm sorry. It was breaking up a tiny bit there. Sorry, Kimberly. What was the question?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, in terms of the advice that you would give your clients, in terms of building a value case for better third-party risk management, are there any additional points that you'd make in relation to this?
No, I mean, I think we covered this here, but there's a number of risk factors, generally speaking, on third parties. But I will tell you, it's happened frequently. It just happened this week on a conversation I was having internally with a company that is trying to enhance and upgrade its function, understanding that it has a significant risk profile. It operates around the world and yet is understaffed, under-resourced, and has substantial risk. And, you know, one thing we didn't really touch on that I want to really impress upon people is applying the lessons learned internally. You will conduct inevitably, whether through outside counsel or internally, you'll find problems, and this is usually after the fact. It usually is kept internally and doesn't require government action. But what you need to do is implement, remediate that issue, implement those measures, and not just specific to that particular project, but make sure it's not a systemic issue. And I think we've seen this happen time and time again in the third-party context. And so I would just impress companies to ensure that you're implementing the lessons learned, and not keeping that information in a vacuum or boxed off, because frequently what we'll find is, and it's not necessarily just one agent that might be used in multiple by multiple different projects, but the type of oversight or omission that led to one problem in one space typically is happening in other parts of the company.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bri. So weak programs that throw the dice, incidents will happen, but a properly resourced, mature program will help you ensure impact is minimized. Take on board the lessons learned as part of the maturation and improvement process as well. So that sort of brings us to the end of the presentation. I know there's been lots of questions coming through. Kyle.
That was great. All right, thank you, Kimberly. Once again, to our audience, if you would like a copy of the slides that were just presented, you can download them from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Let's move on to the Q&A part of your session, and I will read these questions from the audience in no particular order. Kimberly, I'll direct this first question to you. We have a couple of members of the audience that were looking for a little bit more clarity on the 33% inadequate results in the survey. I do believe that was on slide 7. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think that the question was, what's the 33% inadequate? The same respondents for every question. And typically it was, but not completely. So there was some sort of variance there in terms of, some organizations that had some respondents who had said that they had the appropriate resourcing for one, would say they didn't have the appropriate resourcing for the other. But by and large, the greater proportion were the same respondents saying across the board, we don't have the adequate resources with people, for technology, or for continuous improvement.
All right, thank you, Kimberly. And I'll move on to the next question here. Would a failure in cyber internal controls that results in a data breach be sufficient for a look-see by the DOJ, or would this be more likelihood if such deficiency is connected to a money laundering scheme or another criminal activity?
So I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think you have seen DOJ do investigations, particularly on these types of cases. I think the data there was a breach recently with Capital One. I think we even mentioned that involved such a breach, and that was a standalone case that didn't necessarily involve money laundering failures. I mean, the cyber breach space is one of increased scrutiny. When I was in the government, all of our personnel, the Office of Personnel Management had a breach of its own where data was stolen, and so it's something every company is struggling with, and it's something that the government itself is also highly vigilant in trying to enact. And I would say also it's not just U.S. enforcement. Increasingly we see European, EU enforcers, regulators in the EU as well getting involved in this space.
All right, thank you, Fry, and I'll come back to you with the next question here. What are some obvious red flags that would indicate a compliance program is not adequately resourced or empowered to function? From
the government's perspective, what they're going to want to see are two things, I think. One is going to be trend lines internally. Are the numbers of people and the number of dollars spent somewhat consistent with what the expectations will be, and that will be driven by the size of the company, where it's operating, what the risk profile is, and then the second piece of this is going to be, what are your peer companies doing? Because more and more what you see, and this isn't spelled out in the guidance, but it's just human nature, is that regulators are going to view you and judge a company in comparison with how your peers are doing, because most likely they're dealing with other entities that are under investigation in the same industry and in the same countries. And what happens inevitably, I've seen this, is one company that has taken a very forward-leaning approach and is trying to do the right thing internally on compliance, especially after they've gotten tied up in a enforcement action or investigation, moves those expectations forward, on behalf, for all of the other companies that are there. And so that could be they're employing certain data analytic tools, or they're employing aggressive or creative strategies, and so the government then expects each of the companies that they're looking at to be doing the same.
All right, thank you, Fry. I'll move on to the next question here. How do you calibrate risk for a class of third party that does not permit audits?
Well, that's a very interesting question. On the one hand, it's been happening now for years, since before I was even at the FCPA unit. I recall when I was in private practice, 15 years ago, before I went into the government the first time, this question came up, and this expectation that the government's expecting third-party audit rights, expecting companies, if you have the power to contract for these rights, to enforce them. Where it becomes more of an issue in the more recent days is actually when you're dealing with data privacy concerns from EU, particularly Switzerland or France, where you have blocking statutes in place for such information sharing. And that can be difficult, internally at a company or with affiliated entities, but it also certainly becomes an issue when you're dealing with the regulators as well. But to that question, first instance, try to negotiate those terms so that you have more visibility into what the third parties are up to. But it's not it's going to be hard to answer that at a mass blanket level without kind of the details of each particular relationship.
All right, I think we're right near the top of the hour here, so we'll conclude the webcast now. Thank you so much for a very informative session. Again, everyone, our speakers today were Fry Wernick and Kimberly Allen. I'd like to give a special thanks to Aravo for making this webcast possible. Once again, to obtain your CPE credit for this presentation, please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. The webcast will close automatically, and the final examination will be presented in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcast@complianceweek.com. This webcast has been recorded and will be available later today to Compliance Week members on our website under the Webcast tab, which also contains a library of additional CPE webcasts. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a member, please contact us at info@complianceweek.com. For today only, we invite you to use the code WEBCAST365 to receive a membership for just $1 a day. Check out complianceweek.com/membership to learn more. This concludes our webcast. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.